Soldier On acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. We recognise their continuing connection to traditional lands and waters and would like to pay respect to their elders, both past and present. Soldier On would also like to acknowledge the unique nature of military service and the valuable contribution made by former and current defence members and their families to our nation. Thank you to KPMG for generously providing the filming space for this episode. Content warning. The following episode may contain personal accounts of service, trauma, and mental health. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to Saluting Their Service, Contemporary Veteran Journeys, a podcast series where we look at interviewing and discussing the stories of some incredibly inspiring veterans and their families, from their military service through to their transition into civilian life. And today, we're honoured to have the founder of Soldier On, John Bale. John, it's wonderful to see you again today and very grateful for your time and for this opportunity to discuss not only your military service, but your time since leaving uniform.
Well, thanks for having me, Paul. It's a delight.
So, John, by way of introduction, you served in the Australian Army for 12 years and you finished your career as a Chief of Army Scholar, writing on the destigmatisation of post-traumatic stress disorder in the Australian Army. Now, of course, in 2012, you and your wife, Dr. Danielle Clout and Kevin Wilson, founded Soldier On, following what was a really personal experience for you, the death of a colleague and serviceman whilst on deployment in Afghanistan. You're currently a partner at KPMG Australia and also co-founder of Fortum Australia. It's a great honour to have you with us today. And we might just start with, what is it that led you to a career in service? Why is it that you initially joined the military?
I think for me, it was something that was just part and parcel of our family history. So my dad had been in the Army for 21 years before he retired. He was a Army veteran and deployed on operations in the Vietnam War and was part of the Battle of Coral. So it was a really significant part of our family. My brother then joined the Navy and he stayed in for 11 years and went into the Rotary Wing inside a number of different locations around the country and obviously deployed as well domestically. My grandfather was involved in World War II and was a prisoner of war at Changi. So I guess in that way it was kind of part and parcel of the family, if you will, insofar as the service and sacrifice. I think though, in looking back, it was also a consideration on the impact of service, which I didn't really understand until we fully got ingrained in Soldier On. I'm so focused on trying to set the organisation up and focus on others and make sure that we could support them in the ways that we'll talk about and the ways you're continuing to do. But during that process, it was interesting to look back at my own family history and recognise the impacts that this had had from Changi, from Coral, from domestic deployments, and the impact it had on me as an individual kind of growing up into those things. So I think going through the Soldier On experience, it was something that led me to understand that my own service had been something that I'd been brought up to understand. But in being brought up to understand it, I hadn't understand the impacts that my family service had had on our family. And that was something going through that process to really understand the family context of impacts. So for me, it was just something that I wanted to do. It was part of the family. I was also in a country, New South Wales town, Armidale, and it was a great opportunity to be able to do something that was, to be frank, bigger than a small country town. As much as I loved that town, I wanted to do something bigger on a grander scale and get out and do things that were ultimately supporting my country. And I don't regret it at all.
No, well, take us back to the Bale household in country Armidale, and particularly as a young school-aged child. Were those stories of service something that you discussed around the kitchen table? Is it something that was readily communicated within the family, or was it, as is often the case, was it something that was sort of not something discussed?
It was discussed around Anzac Day. And it was actually discussed when I joined the cadet unit at my school. So I went to the Armidale School in Armidale and was part of the cadet unit there. You had to be part of the cadet unit. And my dad decided to volunteer his time during that period to be able to support with his army experience some elements of training there. And I think being back in uniform for him really was something where you saw him change as a person. You saw him more connected, wanting to be a part of something again. And it was great from my perspective then to start to ask him about his service. To that point, to be frank, it has been something that we discussed, as I said, around Anzac Day, maybe around Remembrance Day, but it wasn't really something we discussed in such a way as until he joined the cadet unit. And I think looking back, I wish we had discussed that more without the cadet component earlier. I think it was something that he was very proud of, but that pride wasn't linked, I would say, necessarily to what it is that he did. And it was only really until I was at the Royal Military College and I went on a study tour with my dad to Vietnam to go back. We went to Long Tan, but obviously to Coral as well, and got to walk the actual site where he was in his gun emplacement, where it really hit me what it meant. I think you hear these stories and you talk sometimes around the kitchen table and you talk in the cadet component around what it means to serve. But I think it's only really truly when you sit down and walk the ground, if you will, or allow that person to walk through what they've experienced where you truly understand what sacrifice and service means. So that was, for me, I think, probably the most formative part of my military career, if you will, from a service perspective, from a lived experience, understanding that with my dad. And it was really special to do that just before I graduated Duntroon.
That must have been just a remarkable experience, not only to travel to Vietnam with your father, but to immerse yourself in where he clearly had some formative experiences himself. So what was the sort of emotional takeaway from that experience when a father and a son share that very, very special moment together?
Well, he was only 19, as the song goes, and I was 21 when we went over for that particular trip. We also went to Changi, or the site of Changi as well, which is still a prison, so we couldn't actually visit the site where my grandfather was interned. But we could visit the chapel there, so we got to experience that component as well. We also went to Hellfire Pass, where a lot of his mates ended up, and obviously many of them didn't return to Australia. So I think for me, when I joined, it was that big adventure, leaving a country town, sacrifice that you read in books, but you don't really understand the emotional toll and the implication on individuals and families. And I think going to those locations and going with my dad to see a site where he lost a number of friends, his gun emplacement was almost overrun. It was not the high point of, I would say, of our time in Vietnam, insofar as it was something that was not meant to happen, and the way that the Australians responded in that particular battle was incredibly heroic, and very lucky that I exist because he's very lucky he exists. It was a point where could have easily lost all those Australians. So that really hit home. And it hit home in such a way that you say sacrifice, you read the words, you know, from my perspective, you hear my dad talk about it and my grandfather. To be fair, I didn't know my grandfather that much. He, we talked a little bit about this, but he was of that generation, you don't talk much. And it was only literally on Anzac Day that he would discuss this at all. But with my dad, it was a really emotional experience where I think going into the army proper, if you will, having graduated Duntroon, I think I finally understood what sacrifice meant.
Yeah, it must have been quite a remarkable opportunity to share that experience with your father, not only at that stage in your own military journey, about to leave RMC and continue with a life of service and take up your first posting, whatever that might have been, and we'll come to that shortly. But as a father and a son, sharing that experience together would have been, I'm sure, incredibly impactful and something that remains with you today.
Yeah, it really does. And I think it's one of those journeys that you wish you could do again after your career, if that makes sense, or maybe later in your career, because being quite young, you get the impact, but you don't understand it because, to be frank, it was quite new to me. And I mean that in the sense of the concept of sacrifice and the emotion with my dad on that journey was quite new. Wasn't quite an emotional man when it came to the implications of these things, but it's, this is the first time he'd walked the ground since 1969. This was going to be emotional for him. And I wish I'd got that chance to do it, I think, later in my career as well. And that's something that I think Soldier On gave through others who we worked with, their experiences, and being able to, if not physically walk the ground, if you will, mentally walk the ground and unpack some of those things. And I think it's that level of connection that I was able to build with my dad then that I hadn't had previously either, because doing something like that is hugely emotional from both sides. And it really did, I think, connect me stronger to the Army and to the Defence Force at that time, because it meant more. And I don't mean that the training and all those kind of elements didn't mean a lot. It did, but it just had that extra tangibility that you could almost touch as far as walking the ground. I remember walking past and there was literally a boot on the ground, still half torn, and the battlefield was still there. So it was really raw, and he was quite, as you'd imagine, quite raw walking the ground, and showing me, he's like, this is literally where I was, and this is where I was in my hoochie, and then suddenly these things started to pop up next to me. I thought, oh, what's that? And I realised quite quickly they were bullet holes, and talking through those kind of things in that initially joking kind of manner, which then turned quite emotional. I think it was really special. And I think that's one of the things about, not to jump too far forward, about Soldier On that's been quite special is to walk that ground, if you will, with other veterans, and to unpack those things. Because if they don't unpack them, as I saw with my own dad, they can have real implications on you and real implications on your family.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing, because we know through your experience and through the stories of so many others, it's so critically important to have those opportunities to share experiences like that in a meaningful way, and to be able to go and walk the ground and understand the environment in a way that you don't get through history books or military lessons at RMC, to understand that both on a personal level but also a professional level at this stage in your career, provides a really important foundation, and I'm sure a really significant moment in the relationship of you and your father. And I would imagine it would have been quite a cathartic experience for your dad, having returned for the first time, and to be able to share that experience with his son, who is just about to graduate RMC and embark on his own military journey.
Hugely. And I think that visiting those sites, especially of his father, I think that was just as impactful. I think for him, his father, as I said, didn't talk about this basically at all. It was something that it was just part and parcel of his previous life, not his current life. And I think, again, the one thing that Soldier On has shown me is that is not how life works, and it's not how people work, that you need to be able to sync that service with your current self. And he didn't do that. So I think for my dad, the opportunity to be able to visit Coral was really emotional. It was really impactful. But for him, it was also something that he'd been through and in ways he'd worked through. But it was really, I think, when Dad went back to Hellfire Pass, which my grandfather, his dad didn't go to, but a lot of his friends from Changi did, that he was really truly impacted, I think, because that was, and always is for anyone, any Australian, to see that site and to understand the history of that site. It's really impactful. But for him to think about the way that all of his dad's friends had been treated, and the fact that his dad had almost been treated in the same way, and that he'd never really talked about it. And this was the first time that he was truly unpacking it. as you said, you read in the history books, it's not the same as walking the ground. And it's especially not the same as walking the ground, the same ground that your dad didn't walk, but all his friends did, and many of his friends didn't return. And I think that really impacted him, or did impact him, and I saw that emotion. So I think for me, it showed that Dad was doing something with me that he wished he'd done with his dad. He'd been able to unpack it with me, the implication of what he'd been a part of, the implication of the fact that he'd survived, and also that some of his friends hadn't, and the burden that had on him, whereas his dad never had that opportunity, and to be fair, didn't want to have that opportunity. And so it was something where I really took from that this is an opportunity for me that is amazing, but for him also amazing, incredibly cathartic. And it's these questions now, in developing Soldier On, we spoke a lot about these things, but we didn't link them back to our individual experiences that often. From my wife's experience being a military spouse, she spoke to a lot of other military spouses. And there's a lot of pressure on military spouses that you don't truly understand until you're in that situation. And I think it was the same when it came to that lived experience from me and my family history. You can see it potted through parts of our considerations of Soldier On, and then many other families who replicated that. And really proud that we're trying to allow veterans to have those conversations now, not just through Soldier On, but as a society. And we didn't allow them then, because in not allowing them to happen, and it doesn't mean you have to go overseas to walk the ground, but you can walk the ground, as we said, mentally and just verbally. And to be able to do that is so cathartic, and allows for veterans to really, I think, put in place a understanding of what they went through, an understanding of the implications for them, but also for the future generation, even if that generation doesn't go into the military, an understanding of the implications that could have and might well have on them as a family. And I think that's really, really powerful.
Yeah, and it's one of the objectives of this podcast series, to bring some of these conversations to light and to have them in a really meaningful, positive, constructive way. Of course, it may mean that not everyone can return to walk the ground necessarily, but to be able to have a meaningful conversation around these sorts of experiences is really healthy and, as we know, critically important. I'd just be interested to know, is that experience with your father, that visit to Vietnam, an incredibly rich opportunity, shared experience together? Is it something you talk about subsequently?
Yeah, I think we go back to that as kind of the topic of when we shared something that's beyond, I'd suggest, the usual father-son relationship that you have when you're going through life. It was something where we connected to a different level. And I think, as I said, I wish I'd had some of my own experiences when I'd done that. But in some ways, it was great to set me up to have those experiences in such a way that I actually understood what sacrifice meant and service meant. But it would have been great to do it again, I think, to go, I kind of get that.
And we'll come to the end of your service career shortly, but I'm keen for you just to share some of the key moments or the sort of standout memories or highlights from your time in uniform.
I think for me, and this might seem a little bit cliche, but just bear with me, the best part is actually the people you get to work with. I absolutely love that. I loved getting out there early, regardless of where you were, doing some physical training together, sharing stories, always having that kind of larrikin in the groove who just, regardless of season, weather or terrain, would be laughing or trying to make other people laugh. I really love that. I love that camaraderie and that connection. And I also love the kind of get it done attitude. It didn't really matter what it was. And often it was complex, it was difficult, it had gone wrong sometimes, often. It wasn't the plan that we started with. And I think having that ability to be able to go, okay, it is what it is. We have ways of dealing with this, but I think the way that we dealt with it was to take it as it was and usually take it in our stride to respond to it. So I just miss that as well. I think that's one of the big things that coming out of the military, you're close with your co-workers in other scenarios, but you just don't get that brotherhood, sisterhood in the same way as you do there. And for me, that was the standout. And I was downstairs yesterday grabbing a coffee, and I saw someone I haven't seen for like 13 years who was talking about a mutual mate of ours who left the Australian Defence Force actually and joined the New Zealand Defence Force. And it kind of clicks back straight away with when you were then staff cadets back at Duntroon and then all the way through your career. So I love that. I love the connection, the camaraderie, the shared purpose, and the opportunity to do some pretty interesting and exciting things.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty cool, isn't it? Those shared bonds that you create through these incredibly unique experiences and this unity of purpose that you share with like-minded people, and yet it opens your world, from a young kid having come from Armidale and being a cadet at the Armidale School, and then to experience service in the Australian Army over 12 years and develop these bonds, have these experiences. It weaves a pretty rich tapestry, doesn't it?
And I think it builds a level of trust that is unique. So you literally build a level of trust with the person next to you to do things that, at the end of the day, you could be in a scenario where it's life or death, and you trust them. And that's pretty special. That's really special. And when you say to that young kid, at 17 joining up, that's what you're going to build with people, I don't know if I would have believed that. I don't think anyone would. And I think if you say it to anyone who has served, it's almost taken for granted. It shouldn't be, but it is. We take it for granted that you literally have people with you that personify trust, and that's really special.
And I love that sense of reconnection too, where time is seemingly no barrier. It might be that you've not seen someone for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, but at some point you've served together, you've put each other yourself in their hands in whatever situation and circumstance that might have been. But notwithstanding that period of time that's elapsed, you just meet each other in a coffee line and it's like it was only yesterday.
Yep. And I think it's a unique element of service. And after my soldier on career, I was lucky enough to work with a number of other people to establish an organisation to support emergency services. And there's something similar there. It's different in what they do, but that shared camaraderie, that connection, and it's shared across a bunch of different ways and communities that support either the community or Australia. But for me, being a member of the Australian Army and the Defence Force was something I'm really proud of. And I think that pride is in both the uniform, but the uniform's nothing without the people. So it is truly special and very hard to replicate afterwards, because the world is so different outside versus inside, which obviously something we recognised early on in the Soldier on Peace, and we worked a lot on trying to support people as you transition out so that you can actually gain still that purpose, that meaning, that connection, but recognise it's not going to be the same. But that's okay. There are other ways to maintain that because the people you've built these connections with, they don't disappear, but they, especially if they stay in the military, might be a little bit less accessible than they were before. And you need to work on that. You need to be able to break those barriers down so that you can still recognise that they're serving, you're not, but you might be doing something else that's still serving, but still you can connect and keep that relationship. So I think that's one of the things that is really important in the veteran community, and obviously something Soldier On does. And it's something that is unfortunately in a lot of organisations where you continue to serve, because you're so mission focused, you're so focused on your team delivering an outcome on that mission, that for those that have left, it can be a bit of a wilderness. And I think veterans are doing it quite well. As I said, we moved on to support emergency services and police, and that's not done as well. It is often a proper wilderness, and there's a lot of lessons there, I think, that veterans can bring to that cohort to actually highlight that although not perfect and nothing ever is, the veteran support network that exists is actually really quite strong. There's still that camaraderie, that sense of shared purpose and meaning, regardless if you're in service or out.
So that theme of connection is clearly something that's very important to you. It's sort of shone through in a number of the stories that you've shared. I assume it was a large motivator for starting Soldier On and a significant catalyst for the work that Soldier On did and continues to represent. Can you just talk us through what your thinking was, what the inspiration was for starting Soldier alongside Danielle and Kevin?
Yeah, so for me it was, and this is something that's, it was hugely personal to me, but obviously impacted Danielle as well, and Kevin too, was the death of Michael Fussell, a good mate who I went to school with at the Armidale School. We joined the Army together, and his tragic death in 2008 really impacted, all of us that had served with him or been school friends with him. He's just an incredible guy, amazing family. And again, it's that you see the names on the wall, but you never think it's going to be a mate. And when it was, it really, really impacted us. But in seeing that impact as well, it was just a real privilege to see his family get incredible support from the wider Army, Defence, family, the Armidale community, the wider community. They're still running rugby matches up there every year. Well, it depends. It might be up here or down in Canberra, to commemorate his life and his impact on the Armidale community. So for me, it was, what can we do to recognise the fact that he didn't come back? There were others impacted in that particular incident who did come back. What could we do to support them? And what could we do to support their families as well? And it was a couple of those commandos, as they were, who did come back, and the wider community didn't understand what they'd been through. And if we don't understand, we can't support, we can't help. And so that was really the first thing about Soldier On is, as you say, connection. But it was more connecting Australia to the implications of being over in that particular context in Afghanistan. As you say, you read it, but there was no colour behind it often. It was contact in, someone wounded, and this is happening in Kabul, this is happening in Kandahar, etc. And it was more geopolitics, if you will. And so I guess the first thing we tried to do is to highlight through a couple of veterans who had been impacted by their service that, yes, they had been impacted. And I think that was a bit of a light bulb moment for some people we spoke to. It's kind of like, we didn't consider that. We didn't consider the fact that for every veteran, unfortunately, who was killed, there's a number of others who are physically wounded. And then we introduced the concept of, well, a lot of others who are mentally wounded as well from these conflicts and impacts that don't just flow to them, but also to their families. So it was about connecting that first step, which is there's impacts here. And then also identifying in the same breath that doesn't define them. Just because they've been impacted by their service that we collectively as a country have asked them to do doesn't mean that they should be put, and I use these words then, on the scrap heap of society. Like, they still have so much to give, and that might not be in uniform anymore because they're unable to serve in uniform. But that doesn't mean they don't have anything to give to the community. It doesn't mean they don't have anything to give to their family. And what we need really is the ability to support them to be able to do those things. So being young and naive, we thought, how hard can this be?
We'll come to that.
Let's start something, and as the story goes, that's where we kicked off. But you're right, connection is key. It's interpersonally key, but it's something where I think the lessons learned from Vietnam, where you disconnect the operation necessarily from the politics, had got to a point potentially were the individuals who were deployed at the time. We're talking, 10, 15 years ago now. They weren't really being understood by the community because the community wasn't part of that conflict. And I think you need to add that colour to make sure that we as a community understand that there's implications to this service, and we collectively have, I wouldn't say an obligation because I think it's the wrong word, but an opportunity to support them.
So often people, when they hear these sorts of stories, think about how it is that they might be able to assist, what they might be able to do to help, and often don't necessarily know what the answer to those questions are. You found an answer. You and Danielle and Kevin found an answer through starting Soldier On. So take us back to the start of Soldier On. You would have been in your early 30s, presumably haven't started a charity or a not-for-profit before. This is a brand new experience, a whole new frontier for you. Some might say the most difficult mission of all. So I'm interested to hear what those early days were like, what the challenges were, and some of the obstacles and hurdles along the way.
Yeah, it was, to be honest, we had no idea what charity even meant, as in the construct, the legal entity, then learning this is pre-Australian, the Australian Charities and Non-for-Profit Commission, so none of that existed. So every single state had its own obligations, requirements. We didn't understand how to fundraise and how to connect, I guess, the economics of all of this to a reality of actually delivering services. And even considering delivering services was a very, very long consideration for us. So I think the military does set you up to be, in a way, quite vulnerable insofar as you understand what you know and you also understand what you don't know, because you've tested that and you've tested that vulnerability. And you get to a point where you understand what it is that you can do and what it is that you need help in doing. So we were very open that we have this big mission, vision, we want to achieve X, Y, and Z to support veterans and their families. We're not sure how to do that. We're not sure what you do to achieve those aims. And we just went and asked a lot of people. And we sat down and looked at it from a military perspective. What capabilities do we have? What capabilities we don't? And funnily enough, the ones we don't massively outweighed the ones we do. And then just started to connect the dots. And I've got to say that this town where we're in, Canberra, was amazing for that. I think the passion, though, of what we said and what we wanted to do was able to cover over a number of the sometimes cracks / crevices / monstrous gorges that existed, because that passion was there. Like we said that we wanted to do this for the right reasons, for the right outcomes. And a lot of these things are about timing too. And it was the right time. 2012 was a point in time where things were starting to get more complex in Afghanistan. There were a lot of other operations that we were involved in, and it was a time when things were starting to be set around what does our support look like from a community perspective. There'd been done a lot of work done around the concept of PTSD within inside the Australian Army at the time, and that was starting to flow into the Defence Force. So it was a timing thing as well. And then once we connected, I think, some of those basics through all that support, and once we connected to people who had left the military but were incredibly passionate about what it is that they wanted to see the organisation achieve, we kind of gave that initial vision to everyone, and that permission as well. I think is a strong link to successful founder-led organisations where the founders don't try and control that mission. You set it, but then it has to become others. And if it stays as yours, you'll stay a very small organisation and or won't exist at all, because it's too much for one person. In our case, it was too much for the three of us. It just wasn't something we could do. And you've got to remember, we were still in uniform, delivering outcomes at Headquarters Joint Operations Command, volunteering to set this thing up while going through the process of still being in a very, very busy job at that time. So it was the support of friends. It was the support of, I remember Cavan's network of friends and Danielle's as well, and mine. We just rung our mates and said, hey, now we've got a bit of a structure. We've got some support from people like General A and a few others. We've got a little bit of nous, if you will, from KPMG and a few others from a legal perspective. But we've got all these other jobs that we need filled. Can you lend a hand? This is what we're trying to achieve. And most said yes, and they jumped in and gave time where they could. And it was really that basics of entrepreneurial, building a team, understanding what you're trying to achieve, and then for a lot of things going right and a lot more sometimes going wrong, and just dealing with those and recognising you were trying to do something that was greater than you, and being very focused on the purpose. And yeah, certainly didn't get it right all the time, not even close. It was something though that I think when we gave that permission for others to invest in this so that they could build it as well, that's where I think the success was. I have no non-for-profit experience when I'm sitting there in 2012. None. As I said, didn't really even know how they operated, didn't understand the context of how you deliver services as a non-for-profit. I had no board experience, and none of us had. It was all incredibly new to us. But because we were passionate and we were willing to learn and take advice from others, there's a lot out there. There was a lot of advice and a lot of support, and we just grabbed it.
I think that passion has and continues to really shine through. And in fact, it's that very entrepreneurial, innovative spirit that was clearly evident in those early days of Soldier On that is deeply rooted within Soldier On's DNA, and we still celebrate today. But so too is collaboration. We know that the ESO space is a largely fragmented space. There's a lot of people operating in the space, all doing incredibly good work. But one of our priorities at the moment is to ensure that we're collaborating very effectively and we're reducing the duplication of effort between Soldier On and other organisations, and looking to ensure that veterans and families' needs are being met in the most efficient and effective way, always keeping the veteran and their families' needs as our true north. You've mentioned some of the partners along the way. You've mentioned KPMG having been a tremendous source of support from day one and continues to this time. But who else were some of those partners and allies in those early years?
Yeah, so from a legal perspective, upstairs here, Minter Ellison were fantastic, really helping us to actually put the framework around the organisation. And I didn't appreciate the importance of that governance when we first started. It was quickly identified to me. Peter Lay was very experienced on boards, and a number of the board that we built together, they themselves had been experienced, and it was something that we looked at, and we wanted to distinguish ourselves very quickly with some of the groups that quite hadn't got to that stage. If you're going to invest your hard-earned personal money or your corporate money, we want to make sure that we can show you that it's being managed well, it's governed well, and it's achieving outcomes that we can present back to you and back to society. So that was really important. A range of different industry partners that came on board as well. I think that it was very early in the piece where a range of companies who we approached said yes, which was surprising to us, to be frank. There was a private philanthropist who really helped kick us off. So we went for a meeting with Sir Angus Houston, actually, with this private philanthropist to talk about, and he was supporting as an ambassador for the organisation at the time, with Mark Donaldson VC, and a range of other amazing ambassadors. John Howard came on board and then asked all the other prime ministers who had deployed troops operationally to come on as ambassadors, and they all agreed, which was just fantastic. He felt so passionate, and they all did too. So it was those kind of people who would lend their gravitas to this. And it was then the opportunity to connect that through to some sponsors who were been able to support, not necessarily financially, but just to make sure that what we were doing was actually going to be the best possible thing for the veteran and their family. I guess one of the watershed moments for us where we were able to transition the organisation from predominantly volunteer, including all of us, to then having a few paid staff, which I think increases your capacity to be able to deliver much more for the community, was a private philanthropist came to us. So his story, and he wants to remain private, his story though is that he had a cousin who was a commando, and that cousin had kind of taken him through his deployments as well as connected him to some of the physical facilities that existed around the world to support veterans and their families, particularly in the US with the Walter Reed facility there. He'd been there. He'd been connected to, and excuse the pronunciation, Beit Holcomb, I think it's pronounced, which is it's called the Fighter House in Israel. So it's all of their support for IDF members who have been impacted and or wounded by their service, and looking at their treatment and support. His initial reaction is, I want one of those in Australia. And he was very well off, and we had those discussions. But he got to the point where it was, well, I'd like to see something like that. But to be fair, you can't deliver anything at the moment like that unless you actually have a few staff who can actually deliver this. So he made a proposition to a few of us and said, I'm going to pay your salary. I was still in the army. And I was like, right, okay, well, it was a bit of a decision point here. Do I do this or not?
How far into Soldier On are we?
This is 2 years.
2 years,
So 2 years kind of building the base of, I guess, of support so far as some really simple support programs. We did some activities, taking people through adventure races. We're setting up for the South Pole here. We've done a number of other activities that are more around inspiring the Australian people that just because you're impacted by your service doesn't mean that you can't have an amazing life post-service. So 2 years in, and we'd been working through this process, not so much around our staff and being able to deliver something from a pay perspective, more on the actual physical infrastructure that this particular philanthropist was looking at. But this came as a bit of a surprise to us, and the time turnaround where we had to make a decision was also quite short. So yeah, had that conversation between all of us, and we all said yes. Let's do this. Let's actually take that very generous donation that you've provided, and try and turn this thing into something that's much bigger than the complete volunteer organisation it is, and hope that can really scale the capability that we're starting to build, but also to add the things that we wanted to. And we're very passionate about, and obviously my wife as a clinical psychologist was very passionate about bringing in that mental health component, because we recognised that was going to be absolutely critical from that early intervention, prevention, and sometimes complex and clinical support to make sure that we had that rounded out capacity and capability as eventually we moved many years down the line to the help model. But it was, how do we do that? And you just can't do that without the governance and the requirements that we needed, and to have some staff to actually operate that. So huge opportunity, and we took it. So again, it was just networks on networks on networks. And to be honest, once we got these things going, it just flowed. And I think that showed to us that we're onto something. I think when the phone stops and the email stops and there's no offers of support, you probably would start to question, is this actually wanted by the community? But we really seem to have tapped into something. And yes, many of them were veterans, but many of these supporters were not. Many of them had no military service history themselves, but they just cared. They wanted to do something. And to be fair, and I should have said it at the top, this didn't come out of a thought bubble that we had. We looked heavily overseas. Help for Heroes especially was a huge inspiration for us. We had a lot to do with Wounded Warrior Project as well and understanding their model. They were a behemoth. They were huge. The size and scale of what they were achieving then was just massive. We had a bit to do with Team Rubicon, and the mission continues. So really, it wasn't just doing something in Australia that came as a thought bubble either. It was looking at those comparators. What are they doing? How are they doing it? What can we learn from them? And that was because we wanted to not make the same mistakes that they'd made, but we also wanted to expedite this support to veterans and their families. This didn't exist in the context, and how could we do this better? And I should also mention that we weren't even the same organisation having this idea at the same time. And Mates for Mates existed around the same time. They were a little bit earlier than us, but didn't kind of, I'd say, in my new lexicon, go to market, if you will, before we did. We just went straight out with, okay, let's go. But we then worked together on how we could work together because our philosophies are very similar. We're inspired by similar things. And the services and delivery that we have at that time was quite similar. And we diversified in some ways to them and them to us. But I think we were the new generation of let's focus on the opportunity for your post-career. Let's look at how we can support you and your family during and after, not as much of a focus on that compensation component, which the legacy organisations at that stage, not now, but at that stage were focused on. So it was great to be able to have another organisation that was going through the same pain, the same kind of conversations where you get knocked back 90 times and get one over the line when it comes to some things. It was great to be able to have another organisation that was doing that at the same time.
Yeah, and one of the significant constants throughout Soldier On's history has been the motivation to help veterans and their families take the next step, give them the confidence to take that next step, particularly as they look to transition from a life in service to a life beyond service. It could be said that one of the very first persons to experience that transition was indeed yourself. What was that moment like for you when you hung up the uniform for the last time and sort of threw yourself full-time into Soldier On and all that it stood for?
I didn't feel like I was, in a way. And that was because I was so connected to defence still and was for really the entire Soldier On journey. In such a way, I think I was more connected to defence because instead of just seeing my pocket of the army and my kind of small team that sit in, as you know, the Defence Force and the way it works, you often see a bit of that up and out, but you don't see a lot of it. Not at the rank I was anyway, and the skill set I was building. I'd seen, I think, for me, more than I'd ever seen before when I was at headquarters, Joint Operations Command, kind of, overseeing Australia's domestic and deployed operations capability. That really opened my eyes to the scale of what we do. And I think once you've seen that and been a part of that joint environment, a really significant joint environment, you can't unsee it. And that was the kind of approach that we took into the Soldier On world, which was, okay, how do we make sure that this is not just an Army thing, noting I'm Army, but Kevin was Air Force? How do we make sure that from the two of us, we actually get representations from Navy to make sure that there's unique differences between all three services? How are they recognised? How do members of the APS who deploy on operations as part of these organisations, how do we support them? So it was all of those kind of conversations that we were having to make sure that we could really connect those things together. I'd say my actual transition came when I left Soldier On. I'd say that's when I truly left the Defence Force. I'd left parts of it, obviously. We tried to, and did for a while, do physical training at Soldier On with the team and got out and had actually a former PDI that used to take us out and do some gym work and that kind of stuff. Got involved in some of the activities, but it wasn't as structured, obviously, as the Defence Force, and that was a really fun thing. But leaving, I think, properly, if you will, the world of defence and moving into supporting emergency services and first responders. I love that. I loved doing that. But I think that's where I properly went through my transition moments. I'm not part of that wider community anymore. I'm still a veteran. I'm still connected to this community, but I'm not working in it every day. And as I said, I loved working in and still do a lot of work with emergency services and in the disaster management component as well, and police as well as national security organisations. I loved doing that, but it was different to what I knew. There's a lot of skills and attributes, obviously, you can translate over. And it was kind of weird translating them as we have supported so many thousands of others translate them themselves, and to be able to talk through that. So really did read my, it wasn't mine, it was read the organisation's materials on transitioning and how to do that, the things to watch out for, and the things you need to do in order to support that transition and make it as good as possible. So I really drank that particular Kool-Aid myself. But it was the right thing to do, because it really does help as you start to think, do I have much to add here? This is very different. Even the language, it's a different type of language to what I'm used to. Defence, as you know very well, Paul, has a huge amount of acronyms. And then suddenly you're working in the emergency services and they have a whole new different collection of acronyms. You're like, I feel like I'm starting again. How do I transition into this community? So in that respect, I think having a transition a lot later than my actual transition helped, because I'd been through the soldier on process and supported so many other people, maybe not directly, but we'd supported through the conceptual development of the program, a lot of people transition. And so actually using those things for myself, it helped. It really did. But I don't want to underplay, and I'd said it so many times to so many people, that finding purpose and meaning and connection. And I think I did underplay it in some ways, myself in that first transition period. And yeah, it was something where I had to go invest in doing it, and make sure that I just didn't say it through all these other interviews that we'd had. I actually did it. If anyone who's about to do it, it's critical. It's so important to make sure that when you do transition properly, you still have that purpose and meaning. If it's, with your kids' soccer team, doing something there, it does matter what it is, but it also in some ways doesn't matter as much as you think. It just matters doing it.
Yeah. So yours is a remarkable journey from a proud military history, an upbringing through country New South Wales, a cadet at a Yarmerdale school, this incredibly rich experience with your father returning to Vietnam for the first time, seemingly somewhat formational for you as you're about to graduate RMC yourself and embark on your own 12-year Army career. And then you find yourself setting up a charity for veterans and their families through Soldier On. And after having done that for a number of years, you then shift your focus to emergency services and frontline workers with the establishment of Fortum, which is another tremendous organisation. And now you find yourself here at KPMG. What does that feel like?
Surreal. It's very three-chapter, if you will, current career trajectory. Defence, non-for-profit, yes, most of that non-for-profit was connected to defence, and now corporate. But what led me here was, firstly, it was Anthony Court, was one of the founding board members of Soldier On. As I said, KPMG was instrumental with Minter Ellison and a couple of other organisations right from the get-go at supporting the development of the actual organisational structure, capabilities, business plan, budgets, all of those kind of things that make a charity a charity. Without that support, we wouldn't have ever got off the ground. And then the actual, yes, we knew people and we're connecting to them, but getting them all into the room and getting something out of them that's actually tangible is a complex and difficult thing to do, and you need to do it as a profession. And they were willing to offer all of that for us to support us. So Anthony, through that process, has been both a board member, but also a friend and a mentor. And I came to a point in the non-for-profit journey where I've loved my time, obviously at Soldier On and at Fordham, but I felt with Fordham it was time, usually that 5 to 6 year point. I think organisations, you need to start to consider, if you're still founder-led, what is the next step? And I think that next step is fundamental if the organisation's going to continue in such a way that's going to continue to deliver services where it's part of the system versus being about a person or people. And thankfully, obviously, with Soldier On, that happened and it happened well. And same with Fordham. I'm very lucky that Mick Willing, the former Deputy Commissioner of New South Wales Police, has taken on that role and eminently qualified, obviously, being in service for so long and also having seen the impact, especially from a policing perspective, but also working with emergency services on the impact of policing. And there's so much that I could translate from a Soldier On perspective, but it needed someone, as I said, who wasn't a founder, but also someone who is deeply connected to this sector. And by that, I mean the emergency management and law enforcement sector. And I wasn't. So I think that was really key. But that transition here was an opportunity to continue to build something in particularly the emergency management and disaster management space. And it was an opportunity to continue to work with those organisations that I wanted to work with and had worked with previously, but to do it at a more strategic level. So as much as working on that human face and mental health and well-being is something I am literally still doing here, which is fantastic, I also wanted the opportunity to work on those more strategic settings and some of the considerations that we'd seen through the emergency management phase, especially the way that the states and federal agencies interact and connect and support each other through natural disasters or disaster management. And in that way, I've been able to land here and build and deliver very much purposeful work for those organisations. And I'll be honest, that was a leap of faith because you never know. I'd worked with this organisation now since 2012. But you never know if, as you always go through the transition, and we supported people at Soldier On Fordham with their transition program as well. You never know what's on the sticker is going to be what's in the organisation, if those cultural elements match. I'm really happy to say they do, and the ability to be able to get out and do this kind of work for this sector that I've been involved in now is fantastic at that very strategic level. And I'm really enjoying it. But it's, again, I think ensuring that purpose is maintained and connected through all aspects of your life. And as I said, ultimately, if I hadn't been able to connect the purpose here, I wouldn't have come. But if it didn't pan out to be that purpose, it would have been difficult to stay around because for me, I need that. I need that as part of who I am. And I think a lot of veterans put that aside sometimes when they transition. It becomes about the money, or it becomes about this, or it becomes about that. And there's certain points in your life where that has to be if you need those things. But it's still, if you can't build it at work, how do you build it elsewhere? For me, I think I have to build it at work, and I found it here, and I'm very lucky. But some people won't and can't. So how do you build it outside of work? I just mentioned some organisations that you see people now as veterans volunteer for with SES and RFS, or they might go to Disaster Relief Australia or something like that. And I think there's great ways now that people are starting to recognise that if you can't find it at work, and we can't all, it's as veterans, yes, it's very purpose-driven, but you're just not going to always find it. But if you can't, how do you do it outside, and how do you do that well?
Finally, John, you've been very generous with your storytelling and sharing your journey with us. Thank you. But Soldier On has supported over 26,000 veterans and family members directly and many thousands more indirectly. I'm just interested if you have one piece of advice for our listeners, many of whom are veterans or family members, some of which are looking to transition themselves. You've spoken about the importance of finding purpose. But what's one piece of advice you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think to back yourself. I think that your career in the Defence Force, however long it's been, gives you a unique ability to understand who you are, who you're not, to recognise risk, and to work inside usually a very high risk tolerant environment. And I think talking to so many veterans, the ones who back themselves and recognise that in backing themselves, they're not always going to get it right. In fact, they're going to probably fail more than they will succeed, but that's okay because they know what they want and they know that they'll be able to achieve it in some way, shape or form. And I think it's being able to back yourself in such a way that you can connect all of what you've achieved to an outcome in the future that sometimes veterans don't do on that transition journey. And they don't do it for the very good reason that they've left something that means so much to them, but they've also left something that often is an environment which allows you to do that in a safe environment, a safer environment to try succeed or fail, it can be a bit daunting, more daunting to do that outside of that environment where it's not perceived to be as safe. But I think if you do it outside of that environment, but do it with that support network, whether that be Soldier On or whatever it is, where you've got other veterans who can support you, it gives you that ability to feel safe and to still back yourself. Now, I had a great career, but it wasn't stellar in any way, shape or form. There's many more people who have had careers who have done way more things than I have done, been tested more than I have, and have achieved greater things. And they can go out and do incredible things, but sometimes they don't because they don't back themselves. And I think it's taking the things that got them to that rank or got them to that part of the organisation or got them in the first place. It's taking those things and making sure they don't leave them when the boots come off and they leave the door. They need to make sure that that attitude, that focus, and those attributes as an individual that were selected out of so many others continue to shine through once you leave. And it's been a privilege to, I think, show what can be done. And as I said, there's so many gaps in who I am still and who I'm growing into and what I've learned. But I think at the end, none of this would have happened if we didn't have a crack and didn't have a go and didn't back ourselves.
Well, thank you, John, and to Danny and Kevin as well, and all of those who were so instrumental in those early days of Soldier On for having a crack and for backing yourselves. And today for sharing your story, your remarkable journey with us. It's been a wonderful, potted history of so many incredible moments over that journey, and I thank you for sharing it with us.
Oh, real pleasure, Paul. And thank you for what you're doing now and leading this fantastic organisation. It's really great to see it continue to grow and to support so many veterans. And just a bit of a, I think taken aback when you said 26,000. That's truly incredible. And if you said that to us when we first sat around the kitchen table and said, let's do this thing, I think we would have been saying that you absolutely cannot in any way, shape or form be talking about the same organisation that we started, because that just would make no sense to us. So the fact that we're here, the fact that the organisation has done that, and the incredible staff and the incredible volunteers and the incredible veterans who have used that service and support, and many gone on to then provide their own either volunteer capability to Soldier On or to others. It's a real privilege to be a part of it, and it's great to see it continue to grow under your leadership and to do amazing things. So thank you.
Well, thanks very much, John. And to our viewers and our listeners, thank you for tuning in to Saluting Their Service, Contemporary Journeys of Veterans. We look forward to you joining us next time as we look to uncover more stories, more remarkable, inspiring stories of veterans and their families, all making a difference and an impact both during and after service. This podcast is proudly presented by Soldier On. Soldier On is a not-for-profit veteran support organisation delivering a range of services to enable serving and ex-serving veterans and their families to thrive. Should today's podcast elicit any personal concern, a list of support services can be found in our show notes. Saluting Their Service, Contemporary Voices of Bravery is a proud production of Art Videography and Soldier On. This podcast series was funded by the Department of Veterans Affairs. Thanks for listening.